Okay, so we'll start. I won't do a kind of introduction this time because it's a much more friendly environment in this room. So Charlie, we maybe begin by trying to define you. So, so you're on the website we said you're a sociologist and artist, but one of the things we actually just spoke about before we began was the fact that artists are almost expected to be sociologists, and whether there is a kind of discrepancy in artists about this idea that you're not allowed to really produce what you maybe really want, but what you're kind of socially prescribed to produce. And where are you there?
Well, the thing is that I call myself an artist, but at the same time I'm very outside of the art world, Mm-hmm. So I don't, for instance, have a gallery that represents me, or I work. So in my artwork, it's mainly been I've mainly done projects for for museums and for kind of institutions. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of different because then I don't have the kind of pressure of the art market, mm-hmm. and to talk about the things that the art market talks about. But I definitely think that you're right. There is no artist, or at least now a lot of artists are talking about social issues, mm-hmm. and the current kind of trend in the art world is to make socially engaged art. Mm-hmm.
And we had a reference of Olaf Eliasson, who wouldn't, for example, one of the artists that I tried to think of as somebody who has no social, implication. He's just beautiful things that you look at and you see things. But in fact, he's all about saving Earth from, global warming and things like that.
Right. So there is exactly.
So there's still a social.
There's a pressure on artists now, I think, to save the world. Or at least attempt to save the world, because mm-hmm. no one knows really who else is going to do it. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of this idea that art is a good force in society, and I think actually, if we really look at like the cities that we love, and we look at what artists have done to the cities that we love, they've basically destroyed them, so, but at the same time we keep, there's so much of a kind of solutions to, what do we do with this space, or how do we make a derelict area, how do we invigorate it, and there's always this idea that you put culture in there, you put artists in there, and something amazing will happen. And we've found that what happens is people start selling overpriced coffee ultimately, and that's more or less it, really. Mm-hmm. So, and artists don't have an amazing lives, and they're not very diverse in their kind of activities. Mm-hmm. Usually in a weird way, kind of socially unengaged, because being an artist is such a kind of lonely, isolated job, mm-hmm. and you are so much working for yourself and about yourself, so it's very self-referential, and it's a very kind of narcissistic profession in general.
And if we try to put you in a sort of geopolitical context, so you were born in London, but then we call you as a Dutch artist because you're Dutch. Mm-hmm. But then when we hear you speak, you do sound
I sound very English.
London, yeah.
Well, no, not really. I always got insulted for using American words and having a Dutch accent, and
right.
So I'm more being defined by what I'm not,
Okay. So London. So you use cities in your work as almost, I guess, medium for exploring certain things. So you presumably started from London as the kind of home place.
Right.
So can you maybe tell us how you moved on from, or what is it about London that you learned, and then how you sort of moved on to other things?
So I will quickly go back through my slideshow in that case. So this is a picture I took of the Queen, where it all began.
How old were you?
No, this was like 15 years ago.
Oh, right, okay.
But yeah, I was born in London to Dutch parents, and I was very interested in I went to school and I was friends with a lot of very mixed up people, some of who the most mixed up are here right now.
Okay. Is that why you picked them?
Yeah, to represent. The thing is that, I went to school in London, but I didn't know any truly English people until I met James Westcott when I was, this is her husband, who was, when I was 20. And he was my first fully English person that I met, and it was, so what I experienced was, we were all immigrants and all immigrants from different countries, so we had a kind of pan-immigrant culture and a pan kind of cultural language, and it was really a mashup, and that made me interested in these kind of, this kind of mixtures, these identities, fused identities and hybrid identities, because that's what I experienced, and that's what, for me, London culture was really about, and that was what was interesting about London. But then I went to study sociology in New York, and I was very interested in sociology. But the thing about sociology was that it was always very much about putting everything into these categories and these fixed categories. But what I saw was that actually these categories and everything was kind of out of sync and out of category, and identities were totally shifting, and we were getting kind of, at the time, the internet had just arrived, so for the first time you could say there was a kind of global culture which was totally outside of nationality. And that was what I was interested in recording. And for me, photography was because it was a way of recording things that were in motion, and that's still my interest in photography. So I'm not really interested in art necessarily, or the art world. I'm interested in the kind of visual ways and the visual language and tools to describe basically the changing nature of the world and of people and of identities. And so photographs could kind of, without defining and without, could actually capture these moments in transition, and so that was why I started to work with photography, basically.
So, and then I guess from, you went from London to New York, and then one of your main focuses was China, and so you went to China, and it became almost like a big project.
I'll just click. I came back to London after New York and started working for a magazine called Tank and Mind, and I started taking photographs and writing for this magazine. It was owned by an Iranian guy called Masoud Goursauki, and so it was quite a politically charged kind of fashion and art, which at the time was weird, but now, exactly as you say, everything has to be politically charged. At the time, I remember we did a fashion shoot in the anti-Iraq war demonstration, and I already felt like, wait, does this work, But now that kind of discussion is almost over, because the idea, is it obscene to merge the two, is no more a question. It's now, like you said, kind of compulsory. Then this is a project I did in Cairo in Egypt for Domus magazine. It was pictures of City of the Dead, which is a kind of basically the historic graves in Cairo that have been taken over by, people have started to live there. So migrants have come and started to live in the graves. And I went on a visit in 2005 to the city of Guangzhou in China. This was the pictures of City and the Dead in the Biennale, in Venice Biennale. And then I was asked to put this exhibition in the Guangzhou Triennale in China. So I went to China to do this exhibition. And I was there, basically just had to stay there for 3 months. This was the city Guangzhou in China, which is basically the production capital of the world. So it's So it was. So I stayed there for 3 months, and I learned, where the printers were, and I had I started working with insane printers, where you could like just print, 500 photographs, for like 100 euros, and so suddenly like the production potential, or what I could do with photography, or what I could do with exhibition. Suddenly I got really interested. I'd been working in books and magazines before that, and I got really interested in exhibitions because of the possibility to produce anything in this city. And at the same time, when I did this City of the Dead exhibition, the reaction, this is my studio in China, the reaction of the audience to the photos was so amazing to me, because I had come from London, and so at the opening, firstly there was no alcohol at the opening, which was already revolutionary, and then the fact that people were looking at the pictures, and so what I noticed was this kind of real engagement with the photographs, and then I realized that China was a place particularly, where images of the outside world were still interesting and still, still showed something unknown. And what was happening through the kind of Chinese media was that there was a lot of like lifestyle magazine, and increasingly as kind of, the culture of like consumerism took over, or was taking over, that a lot of the kind of media that showed images of the outside world was about wealth, and showed the kind of wealth of the outside world.
But this image is clearly, telling a political, sending a political message to, whoever is viewing it. Mm-hmm. And when you're in a context of, controlled communism, or whatever it's called, is there a what is it that you're trying to, I guess, communicate in that situation?
Well, Guangzhou is really interesting because...
Or is there a limit to what you are allowed to say? Or what?
In China, see, that's funny, because everyone always thinks that we must have been heavily censored in China. I remember we did the Shenzhen Biennale. I was one of the curators of the Shenzhen Biennale of Urbanism and Architecture. And actually one of my jobs, because I was living in Guangzhou, and I was actually one of the only people working on the project that was in China, so one of my jobs at the time was I had to go to every week and meet with the Communist Party in Shenzhen. So it was like a room full of cigar smoking guys, like the cigar smoke was insane. And I had to present every single project, and get it past there. And what was interesting was that almost every single project that we wanted in got passed. And we had like lots of, projects that were very questioning of China, but they were heavy research, so the questions and the criticisms were kind of hidden, and a lot of it was in English as well. And so that was completely unregulated. And what we found in the end is that the only thing that the censors changed was we had one world map, and on the final, just an hour before the opening, they sent art students to come in, and they had to draw accurately all the extra islands on China that hadn't been shown on the map. So actually what we noticed was that it was a very basic, very rudimentary kind of form of censorship that wasn't really looking into content, They had these kind of censorship.
It might have been to do with your own identity of a foreigner in China.
What do you mean?
Well, it might be that foreigners are maybe allowed.
No, I think it would probably be the opposite. It was a fear that the foreigners were going to come and say difficult things, but I actually didn't. To be honest, I didn't experience that. I didn't experience a fear of what was said. I just experienced a kind of enthusiasm for ideas, actually, and an openness. And what I found in these censored environments is that you push the limits of what you're allowed to say. In the end, I started a magazine with Brendan McGettrick, who is an amazing editor, writer, curator. And we started a magazine which was kind of interviews with foreigners in China and Chinese people outside of China. So it's really about the kind of new relationship between China and the outside world. And again, that was another thing that we had to go through censorship for. But what was interesting is the editors we were working with, because they had this process of censorship, they worked really hard to push to the limit of what you were allowed to say. Whereas I found in America, or even in Holland, that people are very scared of what people will think. So there's a self-censorship because you're not censored. So I've actually found that kind of there's more censorship in Holland for what you can say and what you can't say, because art is this kind of, public thing, and so it's about not being offensive. So the idea, one is you're not allowed to offend the government, which you're less worried about, and the other is you're not allowed to offend your audience, and that's obviously something, that's sort of purely speculative.
So a lot of your work, because you sort of looked at various different cities, a lot of your work is about drawing parallels between different cities, and one of the parallels is to do with censorship. The other parallel maybe is to do with, ethnic identity. That's something that you write about quite a lot. Being a foreigner in China, being a foreigner in the Netherlands, being a foreigner in London, and the kind of sense of being a foreigner everywhere.
Well, in a way, when I got to China, what was interesting to me was the fact, or what the reason I stayed is because this city was. This is the magazine that we made, and this is an exhibition of the magazine. What was interesting was that, actually now in retrospect, it was really it's more interesting because it was kind of globalization at its peak, So I got to China in 2004, and I left in 2010.
That was the 3 months.
Yeah, exactly. The 3 months ended up being 6 years.
Right.
Because I just couldn't leave because the situation was so fascinating, and in the city of Guangzhou, because everything is produced there, the whole world was there, so every single person, it was like the human Noah's Ark in a way. And so I realized that I just needed to be there, and then I would understand how the kind of global economy really worked, and I could go, rather than watching like BBC documentaries about, the relationship between China and Africa, which focuses very much on these kind of broad economic trends. I could actually talk, I could go into the street and meet, people who were supplying Africa with products, traders who were actually having to mediate the kind of global economy, and I found that their stories was a much more nuanced, much more interesting kind of version of what globalization really meant. And it was also at a time when the kind of rest of the world was really opening up. So I worked in Guangzhou, I also worked in Dubai in the same time period, and which was also at this moment when it was kind of thrown its doors open. And at the time I did the exhibition in Dubai, there was like 95% of the people living there were foreign.
It's probably still the case.
It's less now, but it's pretty, but not much less. I mean, it's still very much foreign. But again, the world shifted after that, and there was a kind of closing, and I think, from...
So when do you think the shift happened?
Well, I felt a shift when I was in China during Obama's election, and Hillary Clinton and Obama really, really were very anti-Chinese, and I really actually... Obama now 8 years later was forced to go to the UN and make the case for globalization. But he very much was at the heart of, attacking it. That was the sort of beginning of this kind of new American isolationism. Of course, they'd always been worried about, outsourcing and losing their production capabilities. But at that moment, China had really exploded, and its power was kind of snowballing, and there was this kind of fear from America of, that they would lose control. And I noticed that after that election, that's when they changed the kind of visa entry rules, and it became harder to go in and out of China. And since then, China has kind of closed its doors.
But it's the thing. So it's these big political changes that you've been able to, over the years, trace through your work. How do you think it shows, I guess, in the streetscapes and the photographs of cities?
Well, so for instance,
because that's your medium.
For in Guangzhou, you could go I was there. You could go on the main road, which was Huangqi-Donglu, and it would look almost like an African city. And then I went back in 2005, and I did a kind of for the Shenzhen Biennale. Sorry, 2015 for the Shenzhen Biennale in 2016 or 17. And I revisited the whole area, and what I found was that it was a lot of the foreign presence was gone, And so what was amazing at that moment was it was really particularly a huge African community in Guangzhou. It still is there, but it's now kind of harder as an African to come in and out of the country, because you could previously go to Hong Kong and come back into country. Now you have to go back to your country of origin to get a visa. So it prevents people from kind of, coming in and out. And I lived in China for 6 years on a tourist visa. So obviously I was coming in and out. Obviously I lived there, but there was this kind of allowance of this grey zone, so the kind of grey market, and this illegality was actually encouraged, and I think that's changed now.
So maybe we move on to Lagos. Is it Lagos is coming up?
Let me show you
So this is still China.
This is Lagos, yeah. So let me go back to. So one of the interesting things that I saw in China was there was a very large African community. This is at the Guangzhou Trade Show, which is it's a Canton fair, and they do $12 billion worth of business in a few days. And these are the kind of people that I met there, really tired and bored looking people. But this was what I got interested in, so I started to see that this was kind of basically the new kind of global dynamic, this relationship between China and Africa, that was obviously a kind of would be an answer to, or would totally change the dynamic of kind of Western control over the globe. And so I started to photograph this, and look at these kind of mundane moments. This is an African church. It's actually a French Gothic church in a formerly Russian colonial area, which is taken over by a Nigerian clergy, which is touristed by Chinese who come to take photos of praying black men in front of stained glass windows of white Jesuses. So it was all these moments when these kind of layers of identity and history and everything kind of went on top of each other to make a kind of absurd and surprising kind of moment. So I really wanted to look at what is globalization, and what is it in its most mundane, because we always like to talk about these kind of economic forces, but those economic forces are mediated by people who have extremely mundane jobs and activities. And so it was really about looking at the big in these small details. And what I saw, this for me was a very significant image. Firstly, because they've taken President Obama as their poster boy for Changyu advertising. But also here you can see that they're kind of photoshopping an Asian model to look kind of black. So what was interesting was that the kind of aesthetic and the ideas of beauty and the ideals were changing, and that's what I wanted to capture. And then I also photographed Chinese communities outside of China to sort of show how China, and particularly Guangzhou, which used to be Canton, was really the Cantonese have gone everywhere in the world. So I did a study. I went on a trip to see if there would be a Chinese restaurant in every village in England, and there was. You know, even in Little Middleton, in the middle of like a forest, there's a Chinese restaurant, and I saw that the Chinese are the people that have always, you know, in a way, been, particularly in England and particularly also in Rotterdam, always the people that have been the first kind of others, you know, who have, in a way, and in these villages in England, actually, the Chinese are the ones on these kind of boundaries. You know, in these places where there are no others, they're the only, you know, they're the only contact with something foreign, you know. So I also, when I was in Guangzhou, started to kind of look at globalization, understand that globalization is something that's been thousands and thousands of years in the making, you know, before European colonialism, you know.
And then the city that you looked at next was Lagos in Nigeria.
It was
which
Lagos,
is quite interesting because it's an African city. And maybe it's a point to raise about collaboration in your work. So a lot of your work is sort of collaborative with different other agencies. And do you want to talk about that?
No, maybe not. I'll just skip through that.
That was you, actually.
Yeah, that was a desperate attempt to make money in China. Was the only way was to be a DJ, which I couldn't do. But so my name was DJ Cooley, but I got called DJ Coolies instead, which was. So basically what I did was I allowed my whiteness to be exploited for the sake of, you know...
It was an experiment, so...
it was to make money. And actually no one really wanted a magazine with interviews of African traders, but they did want a girl DJ. So that was about market forces, I guess. Anyway, so this is Lagos. So then when I was been living in China, and then I went to visit Lagos to photograph. But what was interesting about Lagos, it was the first place, I'd been living in China, but it was the first place where I went to where almost everyone knew someone in Guangzhou, you know? So suddenly I saw that this connection between Lagos and Guangzhou was a very, very strong connection. And that's because Nigeria is like Guangzhou, is this kind of hub on the continent where all our products go and then get kind of disseminated through the rest of Africa. So this in a way, I started to see that Lagos and Guangzhou were almost part of one city, you know, and then I started to see, so I went to the Chinatowns in Lagos and the Nigeria towns in China and started to see that a kind of global city isn't anymore a singular city. In a way, cities are now kind of composed of multiple cities. And so I was interested in those moments, you know, so where is a kind of portal to another world, and how does another culture kind of suddenly manifest, and the question of, is this African culture, or is this a kind of African appropriation? You know, are the African churches and the African clubs and the African restaurants in China, are they appropriations, or, you know, they're almost Chinese copies by Africans of African culture?
I mean, it might be nice to think about what is the kind of common ground, because you get Chomsky, right? His theory of universal grammar is about, the way he explained it is, if aliens come to Earth, they'll see all the languages as one language. And is there a kind of similar thing about cities? Is there, what is a kind of common, whether it's a common typology or there is something instinctive about every city that you've been in?
Yeah. Well, like probably an Irish pub. Like there's probably an Irish pub
So it
in
is the
every
kind of little
single
moments like the Chinese takeaway,
Right.
the Irish pub.
Right, and often exactly really mundane, like moment restaurants.
So that's the
and
universal
pubs.
grammar
In a
of
way,
the cities.
in a way, food is probably, and music is
Right.
the place which, you know, but what was interesting is that what I really wanted to create a reaction against was this idea that globalization means that we're all the same, that we're like homogenized, and actually globalization means that we have these more weirder and weirder kind of splintering or hybrids that, you know, that new cultures kind of, you know, a Nigerian and Chinese fusion happens, you know, so even though it looks like you're just recreating something that already exists and it's just this kind of, you know, fabricated copy, at the same time I felt like that was where that's where evolution is really happening. That's where cultural evolution, that's where the kind of originality is, you know. So it's a kind of copy-paste type of originality. It's a different kind of idea of authenticity. And so if we read these moments, if we read this, for instance, we can read this. This is a mall in Dubai, the China-themed thing, the mall in Dubai. And so obviously, you know, we could say this is kind of globalization at its worst, where history is going to get used as a kind of, basically as a decoration for like capitalism. But this is a recreation of, this is a recreation of a ship of Zheng He, who was a Chinese explorer who traveled around the world 50 years before Christopher Columbus. And essentially Zheng He was a person who discovered the world. So this is a testament, and that's a kind of history that's only now being verified with like
in a
scientific...
shopping mall in Dubai.
Exactly. It's a testament to a totally alternative history of the world. And in a way, it's an FU to kind of Western narratives, but it's surrounded by Starbucks and H&M, you know, and you have to know the story to know, you know. So we can read these things in this very obvious way. Or if you look closer, there's a lot more kind of something radical in all of these kind of statements, in a way. Yeah.
I mean, what I find very interesting is the kind of my question of kind of universality of the city is so you're in the AA, architectural school. We expect to see it in a built environment, in the kind of typologies of streets, how houses are laid out, you know, how big the windows are and things like that. But actually, it's in things like Irish pubs and Chinese takeaway, and shopping malls and H&M.
It's unplanned, or in a way, those are the kind of unplanned moments.
The kind of unifiers. So this is
an exhibition I did about Dubai. So
is this the exhibition that was here as well?
No, this was just about Dubai, and this was at the Vitra Design Museum, and it was. I made a kind of book, a 45-meter book, and it was 500 images of Dubai, and I was for the Dubai Arts and Culture Authority, and what they asked is that I would photograph all the different bubbles, cultural bubbles living side by side. So there was almost every single kind of nationality in Dubai, and they'd all recreated their own homes. And yet they were all living in this kind of almost like a kind of apartheid, you know, so they didn't mix. And what was interesting about the Dubai Arts and Culture Authority is they actually requested that I would talk about this explicitly, this kind of apartheid, and it's a kind of new form of multiculturalism, which doesn't aim for integration, and it doesn't aim for understanding, and it doesn't aim for mixing. It's about living side by side without mixing, you know. And I saw that in China, I saw that in Dubai, I saw that in also Houston, all these kind of financial centers where people come because they have to, and they don't come out of curiosity, and a lot in these kind of authoritarian governments where you don't get citizenship very easily. So you're sort of required to stay on the outside, and you're required to stay in your kind of bubble. And I just thought that that's an interesting model of multiculturalism and living together at a time when we are having, you know, the kind of Western model of living together, which is about integration and understanding, and we are living in the kind of chaos, particularly in Holland, where I live now, which is the kind of chaotic outcome of asking people to understand each other, you know, and that this was a kind of utilitarian form of multiculturalism.
So maybe let's go back to that later. Should we talk about Japan?
Yeah.
And your work for metabolism, for both Project Japan, but also the metabolism.
Yeah, so I was in, I think it was in 2009
and that's one of the
or 10.
collaborative works.
Yeah, and this, I was asked to photograph for a Project Japan book, which was about the kind of, you know, Japanese avant-garde architecture movement, in which the post-war moment which was in a way the kind of most inventive. You know, and if you look at this is the building here. This is a metabolist building. And if you look around it, everything that came after became square again, you know. So there was this kind of post-war moment of experimentation that has kind of ended. But anyway, it was a very ideological movement, and I was asked to photograph how it actually was lived in today and how it worked. You know, and so that and I'm really interested in this kind of clash between like life and ideology, you know, and I'm very interested in looking at like where is political ideology, where is it, where do you exist, where do you see it, and also, you know, what happens to big ideas, you know. For example, this, I have more pictures, but this was really interesting because ultimately they were really into round windows, but, you know, they didn't know that 50 years later everyone would buy their furniture at IKEA, and IKEA wouldn't sell circular blinds. You know, so you have this situation where you see all these square blinds in these round windows, you know, and so that actually, you know, that's the dreams of the architects are always compromised and almost, you know, almost always fail in this kind of, you know, a horrendous way. And so I'm interested, I work with architects and architecture only to study the kind of sociological, the impact of life, you know, how life compromises ideals. Okay.
And that was the whole, I guess that was the whole point of the Japanese, the kind of metabolism books, was to explore the living.
Well, yeah, that was my role in it. So they did a really for Taschen. It was a really thorough, comprehensive book. Then I ended up also being asked to make my own book, where I told the stories of taking photographs in the cities, in the buildings, and that was the first time that I really merged kind of taking photographs with writing about the subject really clearly of what I was taking photographs of. You can't see the writing here. This was an exhibition I did of those photographs in a gallery in Tokyo. And what I've always tried to do is try to avoid putting my photographs against a flat surface, you know, or the flatness of photography kind of has always been, I've always tried to get away from it. And what's weird about taking photographs of cities and architecture is that you take this amazing kind of three-dimensional kind of space and then you make it flat and small, and you know, you don't create, you take, and whereas kind of architecture is really about the effect of walking through it. So what I've always tried to do is kind of recreate the effect of walking through it, so that we had mirrors, so that you could kind of have buildings appear behind you, you know, in the exhibition. So you could, and I'm increasingly interested in kind of recreating space. Maybe we could skip, maybe I could skip to my folds and talk about how I've done that. Is that a good idea, or is that?
Yeah, it's a good idea.
again, this is another example of where I've tried to kind of recreate the feeling of being in a city, so that you can kind of try and really, I would like people to walk through a street. And then eventually when I came to Rotterdam, I started making these. So this was in a way a kind of fatigue with the digital. So I came to Rotterdam in 2012, and I'd been in China and Dubai and Houston taking photos, and I had like tens of thousands of images, and they were all, you know, in digital form. And so then I just suddenly didn't want to be at my computer anymore, and I wanted to really work on kind of recreating these places or saying something about these places that wouldn't take a load of explanation and a load of words. I just wanted to communicate the feeling of being there without saying anything. So, you know, so in a way my work goes in two different directions. There's one direction which is this kind of conceptual, which I have to write for, which is kind of really describing what's going on and maybe describing the things that you can't see, and that's really sociology. And then there's this other side to my work, which is kind of purely visual, and it's about space, and it's about kind of recreating spaces. This is a series that I did of alleyways in China, which I then printed on metal and bent in a kind of perspective. So there's a kind of a hyper reality to it.
So that's the work produced in Rotterdam.
This is what I've been doing since.
And this is a book that you've recently published. What happened in Rotterdam? So maybe it's a good question. What happened in Rotterdam, and why did you go back to Rotterdam? Or like, what is it so interesting about Rotterdam?
No, I went to Rotterdam because it was so uninteresting, and I just wanted to go somewhere I'd been like living on kind of illegally in China for 6 years, and I'd been living like illegally in Texas for 3 years, and then I had an incident where I got like randomly.
We're filming this, by the way. we are.
Yeah. I was about to talk about I was ambushed by the police in Texas at one point, where suddenly, just totally randomly, I found myself like face down, handcuffed with a gun to my back. And then I thought, okay, like America, I have to get out of America because there's too many guns here. And then I thought, after that experience, I thought, okay, where can I go where I'm not going to get shot, killed, or in any way where you can't do anything illegal? And then, so I thought, Holland. Although, the funny thing about Holland is I nearly got arrested for crossing the road with a red man, so we're way more likely to get arrested there than anywhere else.
But you described Rotterdam as incredibly multicultural, and I think, to me, it was a surprise. I mean, I didn't know. I didn't really see Rotterdam as a place that's being gentrified at the moment, or a kind of new emerging creative hub, which is the way you've kind of portrayed it in here.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I mean, obviously it was nothing, it's kind of a very mundane seeming city, as in there's not a lot of like obvious signs of like joy or passion, or, you know, like it's not a very like extroverted city. It's very kind of controlled, and it's a real working city, but it fitted in, you know, I went there obviously because it connected to my interest in ports and in hubs, and because these ports are always a place that have kind of been globalized and are multicultural. Exactly, it's a similar situation, that it's multicultural out of, you know, it needs to be, you know, so it became, people went there to work, and so again, there's a different version of tolerance, you know, which is just that people are used to being with different people just because they have to, and they get on with it, and there's that kind of practical attitude to living with difference that I appreciated and I was interested in. And it's funny because Rotterdam actually has the same cultural diversity as New York. So there's 175 different nationalities. You know, so but only 600,000 people, and so and they're all living side by side. So actually, it's you know, you get the kind of like Chinese nail salon next to the, you know, Brazilian waxing place next to the halal butchers. You know, it's all these kind of, again, a lot of it is kind of cliche, you know, and that's why we ignore it, because we've seen it a million times. But in a way, though, what's amazing about Rotterdam is you can see it all in kind of one frame. Yeah. You know, so it's this kind of condensed, the kind of issues of Europe are also there, kind of condensed. And at the same time, some of the solutions are there, you know. So I came to Rotterdam when there was this kind of, there had been in Holland it'd become increasingly right-wing. And I turned up when, you know, there was the election a year ago, and when Wilders nearly won. You know, so, and then there was a lot of talk about how kind of multiculturalism had failed in Holland, whereas actually when you were in Rotterdam, you would see the kind of amazing spectrum of different cultures sort of living side by side, not necessarily interacting, but definitely kind of surprisingly tension-free. You know, so I got interested in Rotterdam because it was kind of similar in that way, but in Europe.
And that's is that the first time you've ever actually lived in Rotterdam?
Yeah, it was the first time that I did. I'd visited there a lot, but it was kind of, moving back to the motherland. So that's what my book is really about. It's about kind of moving back to a motherland. And so there was this kind of and because Holland was so much more liberal and so much more unrepressed, and, you know, England was so conservative compared to Holland. So I grew up with this idea that Holland was this very open, tolerant country. And then I came to Holland and found, you know, in the moment of this kind of right-wing kind of movement, and actually found that Holland was super conservative, and that actually England, by comparison, was, in the interim since my mum had left, was much more, you know, open, and even sexually open, you know. And so in a way the story is, there's a classic version of an immigrant going back to, you know, second generation going back to the motherland, because you're always 40 years behind or whatever, you know, whatever your parents' version of your motherland is, it's a completely inaccurate version. So the story is about, you know.
And how are you, and also the question of how are you perceived in where it should really be your country, your neighbors, but in fact you're probably perceived as a foreigner yourself.
Right. So that was the thing. I had this idea that I would come back to Holland and I would finally be.
So what are you doing now? What are you doing now in Rotterdam? We've seen some of the work that you've produced sort of in Rotterdam, but your research into cities continues.
Now I'm I've just finished writing the book that I've been working on for basically 15 years, which is photographs of 5 different cities. So I've taken the different continents. So one of them is London. They're the cities that I've lived and worked in. One of them is London. One of them is Guangzhou, Lagos, Dubai, and the other is Houston. And I've tried to look at kind of how they're connected, and in a way it's about what the kind of globalization is, and looking at a global aesthetic, and hopefully you kind of in the images get lost, you know, to see that they are no longer distinct cities, you know. But at the same time, there are these incredible global divides and these incredible inequalities that are also obvious and in these photographs. But what was interesting is that I should have done the book 6 years ago, and for many reasons I didn't manage to do it then. But then now, and that's the interesting nature of photography, because you make a historic document, you know, and especially in these countries that are changing so quickly. suddenly 6 months is a different country. So now I can no longer talk about China now because it's a totally different China. But what I ended up recording was this moment of kind of peak globalization. And we all thought we would be going on this kind of linear track and becoming more and more open, but actually, China is totally different now, and Dubai is different now, and so I ended up kind of recording globalization at its kind of high point. And now we're all, searching back for national identities, and I was always wondering why, and I'm looking for the answers of why that happened in these photographs. What made that? What went wrong? And so that's what this kind of book is about. It's about kind of this moment of peak globalization, and looking at it to interpret for what it means. About
so
now.
You are sort of looking back at the kind of life in these cities and very personal accounts.
Yeah, it's a personal account. Well, the photographs aren't personal, but I ended up, this
is very personal.
This is personal, yeah. And the book that I'm working on now is ended up being personal. 6 years ago, I was going to make a book with Lars Müller just of photographs, and it was just going to be photographs of these cities, and I had a really hard time knowing how to caption it or how to say something, because I had this kind of idea of being a sociologist, that you are neutral and that you don't say anything and that you just show places as they are. And I would never ever have put myself into the story, because that would seem narcissistic. And at the same time, now the world has completely changed. You can no longer claim neutrality, particularly as a white person, as a Western person. You can't say these are neutral. And we're so now, we have to declare our identity, say who we are, and you can no longer talk about the world with saying what your perspective is. So suddenly I'm now making a book in a totally different kind of political and cultural climate, where you have to say who you are, and you have to be clear about, your identity and how your identity and your history and your race and everything is kind of embedded in those photographs. So in the end, and that's a strange thing to do as a white person, because, but I've attempted to do it. And so I wrote the kind of stories of going to China, starting off in London. I've made a really personal story about that, captioned the photographs of these 5 cities and my experiences in them. And the writing really, I see it as a kind of science fiction, because it's science because I have this photographic evidence that proves it, but yet it's a fiction because it's a kind of my story of being there. And so the cities are really, it's about the cities and the character of the city, but also kind of anecdotes and stories of the characters in the city. So the conversations and the weird, like I've talked about, the Cantonese rap groups that I've met, and I've talked about all the kind of things that experience that I didn't have photos for.
Should we talk to everyone else in this room? Any questions, thoughts? We don't have a microphone. So
this is
one.
I was interested to know how you changed in these, we're talking as an outsider, almost as a voyeur looking at other people in these situations, but how did you yourself find your perspective changed as you observed the culture itself, or talking to these people?
in where? In
China.
How I changed.
Or your opinion or your perspective.
Well, I think it was the first time that I was obviously a racial minority, and that was very interesting, but it also confronted me with I was confronted with European history, you know what I mean? And also, you know, when you go outside of Europe, you have to confront your kind of colonial history and your connection to that, you know? And of course, at the same time, it's a very strange thing. It was almost impossible to live in China without feeling or connecting to a kind of colonial culture. You know, I don't know if you felt that as well, Brendan. Brendan lived with me in China for some time when we made this magazine. But, you know, it was very difficult because you know, if you go out and, you know, we had to choose between kind of becoming part of a kind of expat kind of group, and then you just are totally living like, you know, like you have this kind of colonial life where you can eat in these, you drink tea and eat cucumber sandwiches or whatever, or, you know, German sausages, or whatever, or, you know, you attempt to kind of live in a way as a local, but then you're always an alien, you know, and you're always an outsider.
I guess, how did it affect your actual work?
I think it affected my work because it just made me very interested in the idea of, well, it was, firstly, living in China was very alienating, you know, and but it was, in a way, allowed me to disconnect from a social life, you know, so I was very much there to work and very much like isolated and in my studio, and so it was really all about work. So in a way it allowed me to kind of put aside my identity and my life and like who I was, you know what I mean, for a minute. In a way I didn't, for the 5 years I almost didn't exist, you know, I ate baby food for like 5 years. Because it was a kind of just observing in a way, like, you know, in a way almost stopped caring about my body, or, you know, it was a kind of mental process. But how, obviously, it connected me to the rest of the world, you know, and it put me in touch with everyone else, you know, and with the whole world. That's what was so beautiful that's why I like China, Guangzhou, and that's why I like Dubai, because it was places where I could be, where you could basically meet everyone, you know, and so that was the thing. You're just kind of outside of your own identity and your own social groups.
So did you find you were documenting what the people were telling, like different perspectives of people? Did you always pick your sort of perspectives on the country?
To a certain extent, but I was there really observing, so I did a lot of interviews. We did a lot of interviews with basically like traders, you know. That was one of the main reasons of being there at first. So it allowed me to kind of, you know, because at the same time, while I was in China, it was interesting because there was a lot of anti-China, as I said, kind of propaganda, Western propaganda, and particularly a lot of criticism about, you know, or a lot of fear-mongering about the relationship between China and Africa. You know, and that was coming from the Western media, and that still happens. And a lot of it was sort of talking about the kind of new exploitation of Africa by the Chinese, you know, and so, you know, if you're in the West, you can completely get engulfed you can believe these stories, you know. And so what was interesting was that I was there experiencing something different from what the Western press was telling me, you know. I actually saw that these like African traders were incredibly empowered by that relationship. You're able to cut out European middlemen, or for example, even the kind of sense of time. You know, in Africa particularly, like European companies often come to Africa with 6 months or year-long contracts, whereas the Chinese worked in 5-year contracts, you know, so there's a kind of, all investments become a bit more long-term investments, you know, so that's what was really interesting, was for me to see suddenly how much of our understanding of the world is a kind of like propaganda and kind of fear that the West comes from the fear that the West has of this kind of changing power dynamic, you know, and I was really excited about that power dynamic, changing power dynamic, and it was something I wanted to record and actually something that I wanted to celebrate, you know, and I got some criticism, or I have had criticism from that, because people are saying, well, you're European, you're a white European, why are you excited about this? You know, there was a kind of suspicion that you should be, as a white European, I shouldn't be celebrating this because it, you know, or there was this confusion, and particularly in the art world, there's this idea that you should talk from your identity and you should talk about who you are, and you should, in a way, support your identity with your work, you know, and obviously that's hard to do as a white European, to talk about your identity in an art context. And I'm still really wrestling with that in this book. Does that kind of answer?
There's another question there.
I was going to ask if in those 5 years you ever learned Chinese?
No, I'm really...
Not for the training itself, but for the communication and fitting in.
No, I did try. I went to Chinese classes, and but the problem is that I was in a Cantonese city, and trying to learn Mandarin. But actually, most people there, Chinese people, weren't actually native Mandarin speakers, so they were already speaking Mandarin as a foreign language, and I was so basically it was kind of a bit of a lost cause. But I also somehow enjoyed not speaking the language, because I had to do everything in mime and in drawing, and actually somehow there's beauty, and that's what was really beautiful. That's what allowed me to live in China. That Chinese people they didn't expect anything from me, and they would do these performances where I'd spend like half an hour drawing something, and people would kind of roll with me, you know, and that actually was a different form of engagement. So if I knew the words, you know, I would have had less engagement if I knew a kind of rudimentary Chinese, and actually having to create a kind of miming process. And then I remember when I was living in China, and I came back to London, and I saw this documentary about Chinese immigrants and how they're treated in London. It was about Chinese DVD salesmen. It was a whole documentary about guys who sell DVDs in London, and basically the kind of violence they faced on the streets of London, and being foreign, and the kind of racism and hatred, you know, and it was so embarrassing to me because, at that time, because of the kind of openness and the curiosity that I had been shown, you know, in the kind of reverse situation.
Is everyone shown that, or just white Europeans?
Yeah, well, exactly. So well, you know, one of the things when we did these interviews with these African traders, like one of the things that they said, we interviewed someone from Zimbabwe who said that he'd gone to a factory in China and he'd asked to have something made, and they said, well, where's Zimbabwe? They were like, is that in Australia? And he said that he had somehow had all of the baggage of history lifted in that moment, you know, when it was just this sort of lack of knowledge about the world, of course, created a moment of openness. And that's what this picture is really about, you know, is that, you know, we always think, you know, the view of Africa in the world is of this picture. You know, like, the African has always been kind of presented, you know, by the white media, by white photographers, as impoverished, as starving. You know, we have this kind of idea of Africa as at the bottom of the kind of global ladder. But in fact, you know, the Africans that come to China are kind of are rich and are bringing money, and are facilitating the kind of economy. There is an opening.
You felt that you received.
I don't. Definitely was not the same, you know, and definitely there was a lot of racism, and there was more and more racism. Weirdly, the more that the media, Western media or global media, like presented itself or had influence, the more the kind of, you know, existing racism and existing stereotypes was kind of brought into the relationships. But there was definitely a moment then where, you know, the Africans represented to the Chinese something totally different, which was a kind of way out of this kind of Western hegemony, and that was definitely like explicit. But you know, a lot of the Africans were, you know, much more hidden in the city. You know, I mean, we were illegal. Like I was living there illegally. You know, so every now and again, someone would come and knock on my door, or police, and where they would go for these, they would look at, I was living in this kind of gated glass tower, gated community, and sometimes they would say, okay, go into this gated community, and they would say, like, where are the foreigners? And then people would lead people to the foreigners, and you would kind of be investigated. But if I didn't open the door, there was nothing that could happen. So I would just look through my peephole, and there'd be a police officer there with all my neighbours around it, and they'd come to get me out. But if I didn't open the door, there was no kind of authority it was not to the level of breaking down the door.
So did the neighbours want you to go?
I don't know if it was that, it was just complying.
Right.
You know, because the next day I'd see the same neighbours who were behind the police officer. I'd see the same neighbours in the elevator, and they'd be like, hi, you know, so it was fine. But it was more complying. Yeah. See, I mean, of course, and that's a sad thing. It's like there is no place which is outside of history, you know. And of course, the white person has always been the kind of wealthy person and has always had the power, you know. And that hasn't necessarily. I mean, you saw that definitely in China. That, you know, there's a lot of the kind of the white European traders. The expensive restaurant was geared at the European traders, you know, so some of the kind of high luxury things were aimed at the European foreigners, you know, so Europeans were still connected to the kind of wealth. But there was this idea that the kind of relationship with Africa would be outside of this kind of corrupted and troubled history. You know, so it was outside of an existing historical narrative, you know, that of course, you know, everyone in the world is sick of.
Mm-hmm. Any more thoughts? Well, Charlie will stick around for another drink or two. You're welcome to come and speak to her. Thank you very much for coming to the AA. That was very, very good. Thank you.